Hi, Mark.
Hi.
It's great to see you. And Mark is my friend. And he wrote a great book, The Direction of Desire. I think was published last year, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
And I like everything. It's spoiler. I like everything about this book except for the words direction and the word desire. But we'll come back to it. Do you want to briefly introduce your book?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a copy of it down here. It's I'm happy to send people, work from it. And it was basically to do, whereas I did my work in pastoral theology and philosophical theology. And if you go to, if you're in the Catholic Church and people are wanting guidance in prayer life or guidance in spiritual life, you'll find that you'll be given, passed over to what we call a spiritual director. And that's a tradition that goes way back in the church, and it's a tradition that also goes way back in many different denominations and religions. It's something that's part and parcel of religion as such. The idea of a spiritual director, a guru, it's part and parcel of the makeup of what we call religious life. And now you'll find that most people who work in the discipline of spiritual direction within the specific denomination of Catholicism, they're usually trained in some form of psychotherapy, right? So, and I noticed the gap, right? And I noticed the gap, it's an obvious one, is that, what spiritual, if a spiritual director exists, hypothetically, what form of psychotherapy do you think, hypothetically, would they be trained in, right? It would be Jungian or psychodynamic, right? So it would be that. And so, or it can even be sort of like classical Freudian or even Adlerian or whatever. But the one that's usually missed out straight away, which is surprising to me, is Lacan. Lacanian analysis is usually completely left out. It's got no pastoral value or significance. And that was interesting to me because, well, at the time of writing, you had other fields of theology, say high philosophical theology and high systematic theology, and they took a massive interest in Lacan. They took a massive interest in Lacan, but they received him as a philosopher. And I remember going to a conference, and it was on spiritual direction, and it was filled to the brim with Jungians. And I said, someone asked me, "What are you doing your work on?" I said, "Oh, I'm doing it on John of the Cross, spiritual direction, and I'm doing it on psychoanalysis." And they go, "Oh, well, what psychoanalyst are you using?" I do this. I said, "I'm doing it on Lacan." And the first thing that they said is, "I'm not a philosopher. Yeah, I don't want anything to do with this. I don't understand it. I don't know it, and I don't get it." And so for me, the whole point of the work was critiquing. It was about filling a gap first, which the gap was about, that Lacan is ignored in pastoral theology. He's interested, they're very interested in systematic theology. There's a certain reception of Lacan, but it's very much the philosophical Lacan, the Lacan that comes through English departments, film studies. It's that Lacan that comes. The clinical Lacan is just it's that's not addressed in high systematic theology. And so when it came to doing a pastoral theology, I wanted to be able to introduce the clinical Lacan. And that work comes through us through the NLS, CFAR. It comes through Darian Leader. It comes through Bruce Fink. All that the early clinical Lacanians who introduced a lot of the writings, especially the writings like the Acquis, the full Acquis. So I wanted to be able to introduce Lacan as a serious pastoral clinician that pastoral theologians and spiritual directors should be interested in. Right. So that was the first thing. The second point was critiquing a problem generally in spiritual direction that really annoyed me. Right. And it annoyed me because of a specific experience that I had in my life. I worked in a pastoral center, right? I worked as a catechist. I worked, it was basically kids. We worked with education. They came to the pastoral center in St. Albans, and we formed people, and we basically gave them a retreat experience. And I worked there for a year, and it was difficult for me because I had this largely charismatic element that it was constantly putting this injunction on me to feel something, to have this sort of experientialist awakening, or some something I'm supposed to encounter in my spiritual formation that would be pedagogically formative in my work as, a retreat, someone who gives retreat work. And it never happened. It never happened. There was nothing that happened. I was very sort of an intellectual person, and my encounter with God is always one is shaped back then. It's shaped by doubt, questions of apophasis, the mystical tradition that wasn't about reducing the mystical to some experientialist encounter, but about this constant question of undoing our presuppositions about what the divine is. You try to explain this in the pastoral center, it's sort of brushed aside. That stuff isn't for you. It's that's high stuff, and maybe theologians of an intellectual disposition who aren't from Liverpool and whatever, they can deal with that. But for you, you need to go and pray. You need to go and have some evangelical encounter with the Holy Spirit. I don't know. It was like this, and I just felt that there was this constant reduction to religion and God and spiritual formation, psycho formation, psycho-spiritual formation, to this idea that it's all got to be reduced to the affective. And my argument was in the book, basically, was that this tendency that we see, and it's not just in Catholicism, it's all over, it's not just in Catholicism, it's all over. It's to do with a type of therapeuticization of religion as such, because it's become cynical in its own methodologies. It's become cynical in its own arguments. No one believes in the ontological argument anymore, right? No one believes that you can prove the existence of God through the ontological argument. No one believes the cosmological. No one believes that reason can reach something, right? And this happened in the 19th century, is that we realized that these arguments are shit. They don't work very well. So what do? We end up going inside. We end up saying, well, if it's not about reason, it's got to do with feelings. We can feel our way to God. We can find something, and then we reduce the idea that God himself, herself, whatever you want to say, Christ, it's this idea that we access that through some spiritual faculty that's buried deep inside of us, right? And so we drew on people like Carl Jung, right? And we drew on people like William James, who give this sort of reductive idea of the spiritual as being about archetypes or some magisterial encounter with sublime dark bliss. Okay, and I'm calling that out and saying that's bullshit as well. I don't think that's right. I think if you look at what John of the Cross and many of the mystics are writing about, it's not just about some therapeutic exposition on a dark sublime experience. No, it's a whole critique of experience as such. He's talking about the darkness of experience as such. And it's about that sort of meta reflection on that dark experience that leads us beyond it. Okay. And that's where you find the running out of language. That's where you find the running out of the affective faculties. Because we've got this sort of conception about how John works. John, for those who don't know, John was a 16th century Carmelite mystic in Spain. And he's basically him and Teresa are seen as the pinnacle of Catholic mystical, arguably of Catholic mystical theology. And so, there's this with John, you find this encounter, this idea of a complete stripping away of the intellect, right? A stripping away of the intellect. We can't conceive God. Now, what you find in modern psychology, therapy, spiritual direction, they think, well, it's a stripping away of the intellect, but it's a developing of the effect. No. If you look at that, it's a stripping away of the effect as well. It's truly nothing. It really is a complete pulling apart of the self. And so my argument is that we need to take this stuff seriously. But my argument is that even though you can see that in certain strands of philosophical theology, you've got people like Dennis Turner's Darkness of God, which is a fantastic work. And he argues this. But for me, that work is great, but it offers no pastoral significance at all. There's no pastoral significance because it's just philosophy. So when it comes to pastoral resources with John and using it, it just ends up in this sort of, a feat sort of therapeuticization. It's all about the effect. Dark, sublime bliss that we can encounter. And I'm arguing that we need to rethink this. And to rethink it, we need a psychoanalyst that allows us to be able to think of a critique of experience. Okay. And so for that, that's where I bring in Lacan.
Mm.
And then I sort of bring the two together, Lacan and John of the Cross, and argue that, we need to be able to offer a pastoral, spiritual psychotherapy, or one or the other, that offers a critique of experience. And this is important today. I think it's important because there is this constant injunction to enjoy and experience everywhere. And we need to start developing spaces where there is no injunction, where, we need to be able to sit with our pain, or we need to be able to sit with our darkness. We need to be able to develop a courage of being lost. Okay. And it's within that we can find something. That's the general gist of the book. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. So the general situation in our society is that it's therapeutic, and everything, including psychoanalysis, therapy, theology, even mystical theology, are reduced to therapeutic effect, the therapeutic tools, with the injunction to enjoy, to be happy, to find um, well-being or wholeness, all
Mhm.
of that. And this is what you are arguing against, and this is how you position your book as against. It doesn't go well with this kind of society, and you can feel it so deep, how everything you write is reduced to feelings, like nothing exists except for within the subject, and it's within the subject that we operate. So how was your book, you think, perceived in, you feel is perceived within this kind of society?
I think it's duly hated by Lacanians, and I think that what's it called, Lacanians didn't like it. I think there's a general side eye and suspicion from Lacanians because it comes with theological presuppositions, and that rightly for Freudians would be like, what is this guy doing? But arguably you could say that there has always been an aspect of Catholic theology that comes through Lacan, but he's always been very muted and careful with it. And maybe I came in with a big hammer, and that wasn't allowed. But I think there's been a general suspicion from the Lacanian community, which I understand. But also on the other side, Catholic theologians, they don't like it as well because they've got suspicion of Lacan. So I'm sort of in this this place, this interstices, this gap where there's a general suspicion, and I'm even suspicious of my own work. It insofar that I'm moving a bit away. Sorry, a bit away. I'm moving further away from that overt critique of experience, and the reason why is because I think when I was writing it, don't forget the work has been spanning over a good a long period of time. It was my doctoral thesis, and then there was time between that and then submitting it, but things have changed. I don't think talking about desire is a good thing anymore. I think that we're moving beyond. We're in a place where we need to be able to sit there, talk about enjoyment, yeah, and we can even be suspicious of logics of jouissance, right? Because it's annoying when people talk of jouissance, because what jouissance are you talking about? But what's it called, that questions of jouissance bring up questions about enjoyment, the body, and we're talking about other jouissance as a type of enjoyment that goes beyond the signifier. And for me, looking at AI, we're looking at how after COVID, people have sort of locked themselves into a more isolatory existence where there seems to be this dual attachment to a type of cruelty, the mocking cruelty that you find, but also as a type of attachment to this idea that victim crucifixion of oneself, and there is this sort of oscillation endlessly between the two. And for me, that logic of saturation that comes into that, and how therapeutic language is utilized in all that. But I don't even think it's therapeutic. It's more psychiatric now, isn't it? It's like people tend to be much more. They find that language limiting. So now it's sort of like a direct grasping of the DSM-5 and more psychiatric, which is even more worrying. That we need to be able to think our way out of that, because there is no questions of desire. I'm still struggling with this, but I think a lot of what I said with that work, it's I've gone a little bit beyond it, not beyond it in terms of progress, but more confused.
Yeah,
So
I wanted to ask you about those two words, but let's say just first mention that you probably wasn't perceived well in the field of pastoral theology because the only way it's surviving right now is because of its authority that it can compete in this bringing wellness or well-being with psychotherapy. There is no way to survive it in contemporary world, and you coming and claiming that you're doing it all wrong. So which is great. So you're not perceived well from Lacanians and from a pastoral theology, which just means that your book is great. And I do love so many things about it, but those main words, the desire and direction, and in general, I have problems with it, maybe because I'm not native speaker. And my entrance into the in English, it was later than entrance in philosophy. Um, and for me, those words are part of the therapeutic uh, perspective. And it means all the things that you argue, those are not the desire and direction. For me, desire is about motivation, it's about transcendence, it's about self-discovery, going somewhere. So it's really psychologized in my perception. And but you claim that it's none of those things. By the way, English ruined for me Plotinus. Once I read Enneads in English, it's like complete self-help. It's horrible.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't even remember why I loved him so much. Like you completely, but you claim that the desire and direction, none of those things. And still, all the English is very therapeutic language. But can you explain what is desire and can you rescue desire and direction?
So it's an interesting thing. I think the first thing is when we talk, I used that term direction of desire, and it pissed off a lot of people, and because especially in spiritual direction, the discipline itself, there's been a whole sort of debate about, what, it seems hierarchical. It seems, authoritative. The spiritual director is the one that directs your desire. It's this idea of, it's got this sort of tyrannical, way of, disciplining ones. But I don't mean, I try to argue that there's aspects of that, in terms of we're talking about desire and its relationship to the law and the signifier. But there's also about questions about the direction of our desire. What's it aiming at? Does it aim at wholeness? Does it aim at nothing? Okay. And so I was trying to bring up that. And obviously, it's also, if you look at John of the Cross, he's constantly asking, what is the direction of desire? The dark night of the soul is precisely that. John of the Cross says, uh, um, fired by love's urgent longing, the sheer grace. I went out unseen. And he's guided in the dark, feeling his way around, trying to find his direction. And so, I was trying to allude to that, but I think the problem that we have, and you are absolutely right about as soon as we hear the word desire, it's reduced already. We don't have, and you mentioned Plotinus and Plato, even that language of desire, we can see it spans out much farther than this idea of it just being reducible down to a type of affective yearning. I want this. It's much more, it's much wider, than this. And even in, people, Lacanians have got this sort of unjustified hatred of Buddhism, right? And it's a Western Buddhism, it's this reception. And I think that that's got a lot to do with aesthetics, right? I think it's got a lot to do with aesthetics. I've been thinking about this recently, going on a slight tangent here, is that if Lacanians are interested in mystical theology, it's got to be sort of very French, it's got to be like Madame Guyon and all that, and, black roses and Baroque statues. That's the type of mysticism they're interested in. Any question of looking at the East, it's tinged with this new ageness that they don't like. And really, I don't think it's about the actual. You go and read a lot of this stuff. It's actually really interesting and cool. What they don't like is the Anglo-American interpretation that comes with it. So it's to do with that. I think it's an aesthetic thing. And so I was reading some stuff on Tibetan Buddhism, which I find fascinating. And they was like, look, I don't even like talking about desire because the way you Westerners interpret desire, you just reduce it down to a feeling. When it's not a feeling, it's much wider than that. It encompasses the whole self and how that whole self is contradictory in many different ways. And desire is about trying to work with these strange contradictions. And then you realize that this person's reading that, that's pretty much, if you go back and look at Neoplatonist and Plato and these, ancient sources, that's what it is. It's just that we've lost a way of understanding it because we've reduced desire down to this Freudian slip there. It's a dire. We reduce it to an affective emotion, and it isn't. And so I argue that if you go back and look at the writings of people like very early Christian mystics, darkness mystics, like a pseudo Dionysius, we tend to interpret something on him that he's almost like a mini version of a darkness mystic who's having this dark experience, and he's not that. He doesn't talk about feelings at all in that text, right?
Mm.
There's nothing to do there. And if you go and read the Neoplatonists and whatnot, it's the same. But what happened, especially in the Western traditions, that you had a movement called affective Dionysianism, which is a certain interpretation that came from the Victorine school, and they're very good and whatnot. But it ends up this idea of reducing the spiritual faculty down to the affect and feelings, and then those are the seeds that allowed a type of reconfiguration of what we talk about when we're talking about spiritual desire. And that's we need to be able to rethink that. You are right, in terms of, I can see completely about, as soon as you say direction of desire, all sorts of questions come up. People will pick up the book thinking and expecting something. And then they open it and find this strange, over cerebral interpretation about what desire is, and then they just close it back, push it away. That's what happens. But I think the argument was relevant then, but I think a lot's changed. I was talking specifically in the context of Catholic spirituality, this sort of gurufication of spirituality, these spiritual directors who are self-helpifying everything. But what's happened since then is that we can see this type of, for spiritual direction everywhere now. The Jordan Peterification of capitalism as such. Everyone's got to become a little spiritual director. Everyone's got to become a spiritual entrepreneur. Everyone's got to sell some kind of spiritual hack that will fix you and fix another person. It's everywhere. Like I was looking at the other day, trauma-informed yoga, and stuff like that. You can see it. It's a problem. So yeah, no, I agree. I don't know what I would change the title to now. It's definitely a problem.
And you mentioned self. So we have now practices of theology, spirituality that are aimed at either at improving self, finding self, making it more whatever spiritual, or with theology is finding wholeness with God or in affective level, something like this. So about constitution of certain self, and all the theology is reduced to this. And desire seems, and direction of desire seems like intuitively within therapeutic society, it seems like it participating in this. One could say that you're arguing the opposite, that is rather deconstitution of self, but I think you're going into like losing self, whatever. But I think you go even beyond this, because it's about, like, it's so negative that it's neither, not the constituting self, neither losing self. It just something something completely different that you try and
I can it's that it's this you can the first is the contradictory point that sounds almost like ego psychology, right? Direction of desire, this will get you what you want. It sounds like a self-help book. It's the whole point is that I'm not here. One of the worst things I think that we have today is this sort of ego inflation. This idea of you can become whole, you can become perfect, you can get what you want, you can grow, and all that's done is made us fragile like balloons. We can become bigger and bigger, and it's just, I think, spirituality for me is about shrinking. It's about vanishing. It's about stripping away. It's about, I don't want to grow. I don't want spiritual growth. Spiritual growth is monstrous to me. It's evil. I don't want to grow as a person. I want to vanish. I want to strip away everything. And the Zizekians and Lacanians will be like nodding. And well, no, because if you read, in Dzogchen and Tibetan spirituality, that's pretty much the same point. It's this idea of pulling everything away. So you realize that this idea of the self, it results in contemplating the darkness of experience as such, which, is openness. There is correlation between the two, but it's something that's what I'm thinking about more and more these days. But I think the only way forward is a way of being able to find ways of embracing, a technology or theology, philosophy of shrinking, because that's the only way that paradoxically we can, let go. It's a question, it's a question of suffering, right? It's this idea of, the worst thing that we can do is aim at healing suffering. I don't think it's a question of that. I think it's a question of becoming that relaxed that suffering doesn't matter anymore. That's the only way I can express it, I think. But I think this idea of a discourse of healing, a discourse of growing, that just makes everything worse to me. And it destroys our ability to relate to others, because the only thing that you can relate to is yourself. That's what I think. I didn't include that in the book, but it's something I would if I could go back.
Yeah, the question of subjectivity, intersubjectivity is interesting. But let me ask something that I'm really interested in to think with you, maybe the difference between depression and the dark night of the soul, both as a process and as a concept. Like, how would you, or maybe there are some coincidences between those.
I think that no, it's a really interesting point. And if you go and read sort of like John of the Cross and his text, back then depression didn't exist. I think it was something that was close to it was called melancholia. But it's not the melancholia of Freud, which is to do with a certain modality of psychosis. He says that it's important that if someone's coming to you in in spiritual direction, you need to be able to distinguish the dark night of the soul with bad humors. Now it's interesting because those questions of bad humors come down to a certain conception of the body, right? That doesn't exist anymore. It's to do with the subtle body, which no longer exists. But you need to be able to do, if the subject is Flemish or or has too much bile and all this. But the point is that the dark night of the soul has to do with a certain disposition of questioning. It's to do with a person coming in with expectations that they had when they went to spiritual direction or spiritual life in terms of engaging in their prayer life. They used to have these wonderful consolations. That's what they call spiritual experiences in those days. You're praying and you feel the bliss, wherever, and you're having moments where you feel God's presence. Then all of a sudden, dryness. There's this dryness and a strange sort of forgetting as well. It's like almost like you go, the point, and this is the key point, is about desire, is that for a person who's depressed, the question doesn't exist. They don't care. They'll go, oh, I don't, the question isn't formulated. But in those who are going through the dark night of the soul, there is this sense of lack. I don't feel God's presence, and I'm forgetting stuff. I even forget what the bliss felt like. I can't even remember stuff. And there's this sense of almost like the self, the stuff of the self is falling away. You're becoming transparent. And so John is talking about that. And those are the differences, sort of phenomenologically back then, of talking what the dark night of the soul is. And John's point, I think, is that when that's happening, this stripping away of the false self. I don't like the language there, but that's paradoxically what we can see as the ramping up of desire. Okay, what we initially thought of as desire, this feeling orientated drive towards effect and consolation, isn't desire. We can call that a type of superficial yearning. When you're going through this stripping away of the self, where you're shrinking and vanishing, where the question becomes more put in relief, even as though you feel yourself vanishing, that's desire. You're encountering desire then. And I think that's quite close in some respects. Obviously, we're not saying, because I'm not one of these people that can end up reducing Lacan into, because he's massive. He's just, the very end Lacan is very different from the Lacan I'm utilizing in this structural sense of in conversation with John of the Cross. And that again is different from the early phenomenological iteration that we find of Lacan. I'm saying that if you look at what Lacan's doing at that point of talking through and being able to operate on a logic of desire as a type of aiming at what we call subjective destitution, then yeah, you can sort of see he's obviously taken something, or there is an influence there from Juanist spirituality of John. What we say Juanist means John of the Cross, Carmelite spirituality. But and I think that would be sort of correct, because his teacher when he was very young was Jean Baruzzi. It's like he was. This guy was like one of the biggest, John of the Cross scholars. Full stop. Fascinating that there hasn't been an English translation of his work, but my wife Wanyong, she's working on this now. She's sorting that out. She's finished it, and hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll all be fine.
Great. I was thinking about the depression is the more term of therapeutic term, and it means that you feeling bad. It's very experientialist, because it means you have going through bad experience of suffering, and it also implies that it has to be fixed. But it's pity for not one can claim that it's something similar of the dark night of the soul. And I was accused, for example, of romanticizing depression, meaning that it's more than, there's something else there. But because it's kind of unfair that you, in both cases, you're feeling horrible, but one is like, just therapeutic, brings you down to earth, and another is all the great things that you're going through. But once you're doing this, once you bring in depression in these terms, making use out of it, it's not the dark night of the soul, because there is no use in both. So it's not, I'm not sure where I'm going here, but
no, the point that you're
dark
making is
night
an
of the soul
interesting one.
is not therapeutic.
No,
Neither is depression,
it's
by the way.
completely.
But it's quite hard to, that's why it's hard to read your book. It's not hard to read, but it's quite hard to map where it belongs, because it doesn't belong anywhere which is currently existing as a shared language or anything. You're kind of installing a new dimension that it hurts one's brain.
I
One
exist
goes
in a
through
cave.
experience of.
I should be put in a cave somewhere. But it's no. You're making a really interesting point, because I accuse a lot of spiritual directors themselves of reducing the dark night of the soul to depression, right? And it's not that. And I think if the dark night of the soul can be anything. It's this idea that it's an encounter with reality. It's this, and your work as well is that it's the question of realism, the idea that an encounter with reality. And when we say reality, we understand not in terms of some reductive scientism, as if we can have a direct encounter with reality by the solidness of it. It's always question of our relationship with the subject. It's always media. It's a question of mediation. But if we're taking that seriously, there's always, we have to encounter the darkness, right? It's always a question. So we have that whole question of, is the depressed person, are they ultimately, deluded, or are they encountering, an aspect of subjectivity and their relation to the world that's actually reflective of, an honesty, about of this stuff. And I think, yeah, that's a wonderful, it's a great argument, and I think there's an aspect of that in the book, in my book, that I'm arguing from a metaphysical theological perspective, because a real encounter with a darkness spirituality, in encountering God as other, the divine as other, ultimately means that we have to encounter the absolute darkness or abyss between the two. The reality of God is one that's, as we gaze upon it, Pseudo Dionysus calls it a blinding darkness, and that one is always one where you're completely destitute. You fall away. So you put the two together, there's no escape here in reality, and there's certainly no escape in religion. We're sort of in a pincer between these 2 points, where you end up, the only thing that you can do is just let go. And I think that for me is my new question. Exploring, an ontology or a spirituality of letting go. But I'm sure if I write anything or put anything out, that might get shut in a cave as well. But it's that's fine. It's okay. But it's I don't know where I'm going now. I'm lost in the dark. It's either way. No, it's an important point that you're making about the question of the dark night of the soul, its relationship to therapeuticism, and how you get this reduction of the dark night to either a generalization of depression, which is a disservice, right? Because depression's much wider than something, because we've got manic depression. We've got a clinical depression, these different depressions. They can't all be one and the same. And it's not just a way of reframing this stuff in a type of syrupy theological language that can open stuff up to people. It's more than that. The Dark Knight is more than that. That's what I think it's important to grasp. And I think Lacan allows that. He allows a way of being able to take psychology without reducing the value of the Dark Knight to a therapeutic expression of depression. He allows it space to be able to interrupt. That's what I was trying to argue. I'd probably go back and fix stuff, but that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, my problem is that you're right. Everything is reduced to experience. Like, how do we feel? Depression is how we feel. We cannot. There is no tools or whatever in our minds to think of anything that it's without reducing it to how we feel. And the dark night of the soul, we're doing the same. Like, it's something. It's about the soul. The self. It's not. It's not even about the night. I don't know what it's about, but like, you cannot. You would always add internalize it, the feeling of it's not about you, it's not about your soul, it's not about your even depression. It's okay, you feel that way, but it doesn't matter. It's something else.
Yeah.
And so you do what you do, you take John of the Cross and you do something in pastoral theology and mythical theology that is different from what is theology today. And you take psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and you do something different, comprehended in a different way than it's normally comprehended. And you bring those two together, establishing something that you probably lack words for, because all the words you're trying to use belong to those two traditions interpreted in their own ways. So trying to, and yeah, that's where you end up with both contradicting theology and contradicting psychoanalysis, but nonetheless establishing something important in this connection between what John of the Cross does for mythical theology and what Lacan does for psychoanalysis, which it's not Lacan anymore in how we know him, and it's not John of the Cross anymore how it's known now, but it's something different. And nonetheless, it's this connection, the similarity, how they both play with each other. Even the mythical theology of John of the Cross and Lacan's psychoanalysis, there is some similarities there that don't belong to none of them organically. It's what important to you.
I think it's really insightful, because I hadn't thought of this. The question of not belonging. That's sort of like just hit me hard. It's thinking about how I write or where I'm writing from. What does it mean to write from a place of not belonging, and how can you make not belonging a way of being able to formulate stuff that is important to you? And I didn't even realize I was doing it, but there is this if you look at my own analysis, and I'm not one for oversharing, but the question of not belonging, that's it's a big thing. I was moved around a lot when I was younger, to do with Thatcherism and being homeless and stuff, and then having difficulties in school and whatnot, but even when I went to university, it was always that question of being this sort of Scouser, Liverpudlian working class person in a university, trying to feeling out of place, that out of placeness, and reflecting on the place of spirituality, which spirituality is always about saying you have a place, and therapeuticism or therapeutic language is about forming a place, a home for yourself, and where you can heal and stuff. Those sort of like formulated came together, and the writing of, writing about the dark night of the soul in John of the Cross, and subjective destitution as an exposition on desire, as a way of being able to frame self as no place, no home, and a way of being able to say, well, look, there's value in this, and because we're living in a culture now where they're selling homes. I mean, not really selling homes, but a false sense of situatedness, a false sense of being. Um, the endless drive to endure, to say that you are there, and you exist, and this is okay, and you will be fine, and everything. And in that consumption of those signifiers, it creates an attachment to suffering and pain in a way that's far, far, far beyond simply looking at yourself as no place, no home, and being able to express a logic of desire that comes from that. And I think you're right. I mean, that's what the book was about, and it's what the book is, and it's sort of been shelved as having no place, and that's probably the best home for it. It's but it's given me something to think on about that. I think that's insightful. Thank you. It's given me something to think about that.
Well, it's good point to finish, but I will I will also ask a couple of things. Like, for example, grace, and how is it different? Some of the words maybe that we can still use and reformulate in a way. How is it different from injunction to enjoy, or maybe, and that's all love, by the way. Those are maybe words that are not fully observed, partially only by therapeutic discourse, and I think you might like the word grace and love in a way.
Grace is an interest, because grace for me, is it's a very Catholic way of talking about the interruption of the spirit, pneuma. They talk about Holy Spirit in other churches and stuff, which Catholics tend to talk about this language of grace. And I think that is ultimately about developing a type of language of gratitude as well. Gratitude is this idea of, well, how can we, it's this idea, you're in a place of destitution, darkness, and whatnot. And it's this idea that the only way that you can break free from a type of monotony is by nurturing a type of gratitude. Now, this sounds perverse because it comes close to the idea of, well, how can you be gracious for suffering? How can you offer a type of gratitude for horror and pain and all that stuff? And I suppose it comes down when you start to develop that, and I don't mean this in a perverse sense, but it's about nurturing a sense of being surprised, right? Because if you allow yourself to be surprised, even in those situations that ultimately create a type of pessimism, not in the sense that but a type of expectation that it's all going to be the same, right? And it's interesting. There's a great book called Black Easter. Have you ever read this book by it's a great book because it ends in hell, and it ends in hell, it goes there and it looks beautiful, like a heaven, but the point is it's all one monotonous note. I think I might be getting books mixed up, but it's the sameness of hell that ultimately creates a type of suffering. It's the inability of surprise, it's the inability of novelty. And I think for me, nurturing an openness to being surprised is synonymous with a type of gratitude, a type of thankfulness for existence as such, even in its horror. Because as soon as you do that, you open yourself up, you become open. You allow yourself to be surprised by the smallness of things, the littleness of things, even in absolute destitution. And once that happens, you can create something new. You can allow yourself to be opened up. That's what I mean by grace. And there is something of grace is seen in the for me, it's the body of Christ. It's if you look, and I don't mean to sound cheesy, but I'm always going to sound cheesy, from a Catholic theological perspective, and we're talking about the cross. Is that, you look at the cross, you see, and then you put yourself in the mind of, the ancients, and you say, this guy was supposed to be, a king. Look at him, he's being given the worst death possible. And supposedly we've got this idea of, God was supposed to identify as, a conquering king, and now we've got this guy nailed to a cross in Golgotha, and the shit on the floor. It's just, blood and horror and suffering. So we've got the story of God doesn't just identify with flesh, he identifies with mangled human flesh. But even in that absolute horror and terror and death and stench, there is still this expectation to be surprised. And in that sense, it's that, that for me is the message. That for me is a type of gratitude, nurturing that receptivity of the body, where you can allow yourself to still be surprised even in destitution. I suppose what I'm talking about here is an optimism that's so horrific that it's almost perverse. It's terrible. People would rather have hopelessness than that type of optimism.
Mm.
That's what I was trying to get at. But I think that that's the message of Christianity. I think that that is what it's about.
Mm. Optimism as real pessimism, as a form of despair. I like this idea. I might become optimist.
I think a real optimism is beyond it's horror. There is nothing more perverse and disgusting than someone in imagine the very worst terrible situations, and you can still see in them, and you see the stories like this as well. You can read various mythologies and whatever, and books of these people who have opened something. They become open in a way that's surprising. They're in these terrible, disgusting. They're wandering the charnel grounds, and they're sat there like kings. How the fuck are you doing that? That to me is a type of divine madness that we need to sort of nurture. It's disgusting and it's beautiful, and that's what I think. If we're looking at what the heart of Christian spirituality is, it's that connection between the body, embodiment, receptivity, graciousness to existence as such, and this constant nurturing of our ability to be surprised even in the most horrific situations. And if you start doing that, it inspires others to do it as well. That's what I think is at the heart. What I was trying to struggle to say in that book, when I'm coming around or trying to articulate it in a different way. I'm starting to put some ideas together. It's difficult because, as you know, when you're starting to talk about this stuff, you run up against the barrier of language as such. You start to talk yourself into these sort of strange little circles, and then you write it, you look at it, you delete it. But hopefully I'll get somewhere and put some text together and put it out. That's where I'm at. I'm trying to articulate.
I wish you good luck in your out of placeness. I think it
Right?
cannot get darker, any more darker, so we should finish in time.
That's I'm not going to dark retreats over there. I was reading about dark retreats. Have you ever heard about these? It's
No.
fascinating. It's these monks, they literally put themselves. You've heard of flotation tanks, right? It's like they put themselves in a box and stuff. But these people like put themselves completely in dark for like 47 days, and they allow themselves to basically go mad in these until it's full blown hallucinations. I was looking at this, and why would anyone do this? Why would anyone do that to themselves? It's horrible. Here's me writing about the dark night of the soul, thinking it's radical, and then you got these guys, and literally it's some form of Buddhism doing dark retreats, and it just makes it look so small in comparison. They're sort of like putting themselves in a situation where they have no light, no dark for 47 days, and then they come out and they're okay. How would anyone do that? And why would anyone do that to themselves? Sorry, I was just thinking about Dark Night of the Soul and people actually doing it. But I'm not going to go and sit in a cell for 47 days. I'll be happy in my non-place. That's it.
They're doing it wrong.
That's it.
All right, Mark. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you and talk to you again.
No problem. Are you staying on for a second? Is that okay?
Yeah. Wait.